day and welcome to today's webcast. This call is being recorded. And now to begin the program, I would like to introduce Tracy Cook.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast, Data Growth, Disaster Recovery's Worst Nightmare, sponsored by Veeam and ExaGrid. I'm Tracy Cook with Redmond Magazine and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, let me take care of a few housekeeping details. Please feel free to type your questions into the Ask a Question box on the console at any time during the presentation. We'll address as many of your questions as we can during the live event, and this webcast is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing. You'll be able to access the replay using the same link you used today, and it should be available tomorrow. And now a little bit about our moderator. Today we have Nick Cavalancia, founder and chief Techvangelist at Techvangelism. He has over 25 years of enterprise IT experience with 10 years as a tech marketing executive. Nick is an accomplished technology writer, consultant, trainer, speaker, and columnist. So we're in great shape. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the event over to Nick. Nick, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Hey, everybody, welcome today to today's webcast. I'm really glad to talk about this topic. It's actually kind of a big one for, I think, most of us. We're very well aware of the fact that data is growing at an alarming rate. I'm joined today by Mike Stanford from Veeam and Marc Recipe from ExaGrid. Hey, guys, thank you for joining me today. Welcome.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Glad you guys are here. We're going to have a little bit of a different format for you guys in the audience today. Rather than this being sort of death by PowerPoint that you might be used to, none of us really like that. It's actually a pretty light slide deck. This is more of a conversational format today. You've probably been on some of my webcasts before. You might have, where we're trying to utilize this format to give you an opportunity to hear from the vendor and really get educated on the topic at hand. Of course, with today's topic, we've got both Mike and Marc are going to provide some really good input on this issue here. So there's not a tremendous amount of slides. I think I've got a total of about 5 slides, 6 slides, something like that. More so I want you to focus on the conversation, so sit back. Don't feel like you got to stay with your eyes glued to the screen. Maybe you got some other things going on. You're trying to put on a couple fires while you're listening to today's webcast. It's the perfect one for that. Like Tracy mentioned, use the Q&A box. If you want to provide any comments, a question, something like that while we're talking, we want to involve you as much as we can in the conversation, so make sure that you do that so we can kind of bring you in and get your feedback on what we're doing today. So let's talk a little bit about this issue of data growth. And I think the thing to really think about here, and you've seen this term probably used in a number of different articles, some different reports, even Gartner talks about this quite a bit, is the use of the term exponential growth. And we're seeing this massive amount of growth. I was just reading the other day, this was a 2017 report. I'm trying to think who I read it from. It wasn't Gartner, it was somebody else, but they were actually estimating that data is doubling every couple of years here. And that's a huge amount of growth here. And part of the reason for that really is because of the types of data that are being used by your organizations like yours. It used to be, if you go back like I do, Tracy mentioned I've been 25 years in IT, we had files. We had a Word doc, or back then we had WordPerfect docs if you go that far. Even back before then, Q&A docs if you go really far back with me. But anyways, that's enough of Sherman and the Wayback Machine. It used to just be business data. It was files that were spreadsheets and Word docs or whatever, that sort of thing. And what we're seeing today is there's data of a couple of different types that are being leveraged by businesses in order to remain competitive, in order to try and get ahead, make sure that they're the industry leader and so on. And I kind of mark them as this way. You have the business data on the left. That's, again, the files and the databases and the spreadsheets and whatever you're building there. But then you've got sensor data. And sensor data is, you talk about IoT. Now we're trying to take sensor data as a way of gathering information. And then you even have human data on human behavior and what they're doing as well. And a lot of this adds up together to kind of represent what's going on in the organization. So in a lot of cases, businesses are trying to utilize each of these and then do a fair amount of analysis, particularly of the sensor and the human data. For example, in the human data, you've got security measures around things like user behavior analytics and user activity monitoring. And with sensor data, you could have things like someone maybe looking at and analyzing data around a company that's got a fleet of trucks, and they're trying to figure out what kind of gas mileage this truck's getting, or how often do the drivers stop, or those kind of things. I've even heard of sensor data inside the outfits of fleet drivers. They can figure out what their health is, whether they're getting tired or not. I mean, really kind of strange things that we wouldn't think of normally, but this is what businesses are trying to do, and this is part of what's causing this exponential growth. And what they're doing with this analysis is trying to come up with actionable insight in order to make a really good business decisions. And this is the level of granularity we're at. So what I want to do, Mike and Mark, is I want to talk a little bit with you guys about this idea of, and this is even in like the abstract, I think, for the webcast. It was kind of like it's a given. I mean, the more data we have to work with, the larger the backups are going to be. In some cases, the tougher the disaster recovery is going to be and that sort of thing. And it's because of the fact that we have this increased reliance on the data. We need to have our systems, our applications, our data all up and running. You know, we're not even talking about, in some cases, availability. We're talking about resilience at this point, things like that, where we just really need to make sure we have the data accessible and to get back up and running. And the impact to this reliance on the data it impacts the size of the backup itself and the need to recover it. And I've got a couple of things here where the impacts are on backups and data size. I'm thinking around the terms of recoverability. Like, what do I actually need to recover from a business standpoint? Do I need to recover entire systems? I'm assuming virtually, right? That sort of thing. But recover entire systems. What data sets do I need? Do I need to have an entire SAN or NAS or something recovered as well? That sort of stuff. The retrieval, sort of both the time for retrieval as well as the amount of data that has to be retrieved. Other aspects, things like retention and even archive that comes into play, where do we need to keep a backup of, for example, all the sensor data, and for how long? Once we've analyzed it, do we need to go back? Are we going to want to figure out this year against last year, this year against 10 years ago, that sort of thing as the clock rolls forward, how much of today's data needs to be retained later on? And in a lot of ways, I see this sort of as changing everything about DR because of just the data size. So, Mike, let me pull you into the conversation first, if I may, and ask you, what do you see the impact of this increase in data? What's the impact on backup requirements?
Well, so one of the things we're seeing is huge amount of investment, especially with a lot of different organizations, in storage, right? Storage is king in this sort of thing. So one of the things I've never run into is, okay, we want to go ahead and deprecate all this storage and not buy anymore. I am not seeing that at all. So one of the things we're seeing is not only do we have a lot of folks who need to keep that data, but we're also seeing a lot of things with, just over the past couple of years with some of the disasters we've seen, is the data is not only important to keep it, but it's also important to keep it in several different places, right? So with regard to that, we're seeing, increased costs in the storage technology, as well as the increased costs in the resilience of where it's sitting at, as you mentioned before. So that's one of the things we're seeing quite a bit over here at Veeam.
Yeah, it's a great point, Michael, and this is Mark from ExaGrid. So it's interesting that you mentioned the data doubling. Your data only really has to be growing at about 30% annual growth rate for it to be doubling every 2.5 years. That's really not a lot of data growth. That's on the modest side. So we're definitely seeing the same thing. We're seeing not only the data growth from all of the various sources of data, the consumer data, the business data, et cetera, the regulatory requirements, but also the need to keep it longer and longer because of regulatory aspects. We've got GDPR coming up in Europe, which is going to change the whole way we retain data. So it's extremely important to have, a retention strategy. And I think not only the on-premise aspects of it are important, but also what role does the cloud play in that retention?
Sure. And one thing I'd actually add there. So one thing I'd actually add there, we've been through this before, right? Speaking of the regulations. So I got into this business back in the early 90s, and since then we got, HIPAA came up, we had SOX come up, all these different regulatory things. And again, the one common denominator between all of those things is the requirement for retention has greatly increased the requirement for us to be able to keep all these sets of data and have them readily available for legal purposes, et cetera.
It's interesting, as you both mentioned in one fashion or another, the idea of Mark, you mentioned the cloud. Mike, you mentioned multiple data sets, and it kind of goes back to the old 3-2-1 backup rule. And one of those is having 3 copies of your backup. One of them, of course, is in production, 2 different mediums, and 1 off-site. And so it really does. We're kind of getting back to basics at the same time, but this idea of having so much more data, it makes it a little tougher. Mark, let me ask you. What do you think the immediate and sort of the long-term impact is on infrastructure as it pertains to this growth in data?
Well, I think it's as it's always been. Data has been growing exponentially for a long time. And I think you have to separate the idea of the primary copy of data, which is the day in and day out production data that we use every day to just run our businesses. And that obviously has a huge impact on primary storage, the performance profiles of primary storage, and we're seeing a lot of innovation in primary storage in terms of performance, the use of flash technology, et cetera, networking performance, and so on. But it has an exponential effect on backup storage because a backup storage is always a multiple of what you have in your primary storage. So as this data growth continues, you have to multiply that primary storage instance by the number of copies, which can be anywhere from weeks to months to multiple years worth of copies of that primary storage for backup data. And when you consider your backup strategy, both in the software and the storage aspect of it, you really have to look at what is the right architecture to store and make all of that data recoverable within the SLAs that you've given to your business.
Yeah, and you know what I would add to that? You had mentioned the improvements in the technology. It made me think about something. So when I first got into this business, in 1995, I guess, I came out of school and I went to work for a government agency. And I remember I was amazed. It was the first time I ever saw RAID technology. And they had a RAID that was 2 terabytes, and that was huge. And short time later, we're looking at petabyte scale. Not only we're looking at petabyte scale, we're also looking at petabyte scale on a much smaller scale physically. So back then, for us to have that much storage in one space was a whole lot of spindles. Whereas now, mentioning flash storage, for example, in just a couple of U, for example, I can put together exponentially more storage than I would have ever had back when we started. So just watching the industry and seeing what it's doing has been pretty fascinating in the last couple of years.
It seems like even though we're seeing that shrinkage in the size, obviously there's still a bit of tangible cost, which is something I want us to talk about a little bit, which is this data growth and what does it really cost our audience here. And as I think about it, the first thing that you heard Mike mention, one of the very first questions I talked about what's the impact, he talked about hardware. And he's the Veeam guy. He's the software guy on the call. Mark's the hardware guy, but even Veeam is saying hardware. But it's the obvious one, right? You guys in the audience know that. I'm going to have to get more hardware. The good news is, something that Mike just brought up, the fact that we've got much smaller footprints in terms of with the solid-state drives and that kind of thing makes it a lot easier with flash storage to be able to get a lot of data on a small scale. But there are a bunch of other costs that kind of come into play. I'm going to name a couple of them, and then Mike and Mark, I'm probably going to ask you guys to maybe fill in some blanks, some ones that you're thinking of as well, because I wanted to make sure that I could keep you guys in the conversation here. I'm thinking around the management of all that storage, because maybe not all of you are on flash storage yet. Some of you are still on spindles, and you've got a number of SANs, and you've got a number of different sets of hardware that you've got to manage, and as that grows, someone has to manage that storage. You're looking maybe in some cases of if you're doing everything sort of on-prem or in an off-site data center or something like that, maybe you've got tiers of storage already lined up so that you've got your primary set of storage, you've got an archive, you've got something that's more a cold storage, that sort of thing, or even if you're going to the cloud, same kind of concept, but there's a management that has to go on there. There's the idea of costs of retention, especially now. I think, Mark, you mentioned that as well with the archival retention requirements that are going on. The cost there involved of having to have that much more storage. Like Mark mentioned the multiplier there. Retrievable costs as well, especially if it's something that's not online. If you have something offline, you've got something, if you're going back to tape, if you just have a disk that's set off-site, whatever the case is, there's retrieval costs. Even if you say, no, we're just going to go to the cloud and you want to go one of that direction, there's still retrieval costs in a lot of cases, particularly egress costs to get it out of a particular cloud back down to on-premises as an example, or even retrieval costs if you're trying to get it out of like a cold or warm storage type of thing. So that's just kind of a short list. I should probably put the slide up. Sorry about that. I clicked one too many times. That's just a real brief list. Mark, I named some of the tangible sources I could think of. Maybe what are some of the sources that you see that are some of the costs of data growth?
So I think the biggest cost of data growth is mistakes, and that's where you don't plan ahead for either your primary storage strategy or your secondary storage strategy. And what can happen is, for example, in the backup realm, there's no question that in this day and age, data deduplication is a critical ingredient of backup strategy. Because of the fact that we keep weeks, months, years of the same backup data over and over again, just lends itself to the premise that data deduplication can be a huge asset. However, not every data deduplication algorithm is created equally. So if you select the wrong combination of technologies to store your backup data using data deduplication, you can end up paying far more than you should for the storage of all of your critical backup data. So it's really key to talk with your vendors, talk with your partners, do your research to understand, if I use the following combination of deduplication technologies, what is my storage cost ultimately going to be? Is this the maximum reduction that I can get, and therefore I'm going to have a reasonable backup storage cost, or have I missed something, and am I ultimately going to end up using far more storage than I need to, which not only costs more up front, but also costs more for ongoing management, maintenance, et cetera.
Yeah, I would actually add to that, not only that, but I would also add the time factor into it. So not only do we have the cost of the storage itself, but the cost of, with retrieval, how quickly can we get that data back, right? So depending upon the application we're talking about, it could be very, very detrimental if it takes a long time. And this is, to that point, with not all algorithms are baked or equal. We've worked with some vendors who had great time getting stuff back up and running because the algorithms can get the compression, the dedupe done, and then undo that for rehydration is really good. But by that same token, we've had some where you click on it and then you're waiting a half an hour for an instant VM recovery. So really depending upon what your business needs and what your SLAs are, that's something really to consider is how fast is my performance and how much is it going to cost me. So say, for instance, my line of business production application that does real-time financial transactions, right? So if that goes down for 2 hours, I'm in big trouble. So to his point, getting something really, really high speed, really, really high efficiency is going to be a key factor here in making those kinds of decisions.
Love the input, because those are a lot of very good, both tangible and intangible costs. So you guys in the audience, I hope that really it gives you kind of a well-rounded view of the cost of data growth, because it isn't just I got to buy more hardware. There's a lot of other factors that kind of come into play. And so, Mark, you kind of touched on a little bit of our third slide that we've got in here, really talking about decreasing storage with deduplication. And that's really kind of the crux of this. For you guys in the audience, when you're trying to figure out a way that you've got this data growth, again, it's the worst nightmare for your DR. How do I manage this? Part of it can be you have to figure out what's critical and how many copies of something and what are you going to retain, and you try to minimize what you're actually backing up. But to kind of Michael's point, I'm going to kind of stem off a little bit from what you mentioned, Michael, but there are systems that are going to be critical, and there's no way around it, especially if you start going, he mentioned, an instant VM recovery taking 30 minutes just to get the data. I think that went by really fast, and probably some of you didn't catch that. That's bad, right? That's not instant. That's the opposite of instant. And so the idea of one of the ways to try to address this is this idea of deduplication. Now, I put up here that it's not a simple concept because it isn't. I mean, some people think it's compression. In fact, Mark, I'm probably going to ask you for a quick definition of your own in a minute, but I'm going to give kind of a generic one here. It is the process of taking data that is duplicative, that is alike, and shrinking it down to something much smaller. It's in concept, most people think it's compression, but it's not. This is really about trying to consolidate like data together in a way that's intelligent, and I'll let him give a better example of maybe even what ExaGrid does. But the reality is deduplication also takes into account a couple of other factors here and tries to balance these factors. And the first one is the size that's going to be attained. But not just about let me get the maximum, or excuse me, I should say the minimum size possible. It's not just that, it's also mixed with what's the performance going to be. Back to Michael's earlier comment about the how long does it take to get the data back. You got to find a balance there between I want to reduce the size as much as possible, but I want to make sure that I can get it as quickly as possible. And you have to find a balance there. And there's a couple things we'll talk about in a question or two that I've got here lined up. And then the backups that you want to create. How many backups are you creating? How often are they being created? What's being backed up? Is it an entire system? Is it just a particular data set within a particular system, et cetera, et cetera? And then also the storage that you have accessible to you. And are you going, again, purely on-prem? Are you trying to do something in the cloud? Are you trying to do something that's a hybrid approach? Then this is really kind of a delicate approach of what you're going to be doing here. Mark, like I said, I gave kind of my own definition of deduplication, and it's sort of generic because I want to leave that to you because you're more the expert at this than I think anybody else in the call. So would you maybe start by giving the audience your definition of deduplication?
Sure, I appreciate it, Nick. That's a great introduction. So your definition was right on, and one of the important things that you said was it's not simply compression, and I think that's a mythology that sometimes exists in the industry because compression, eventually settled down to 2 or 3 different well-known algorithms. They all get roughly the same effect depending on, the type of data you're dealing with. But deduplication is much more variable. There are a number of vendors who have implemented deduplication, and the results vary greatly because of a number of different aspects of the algorithm. The size of the objects that they examine, for example, when they deduplicate, whether or not they're able to deal with the fact that those objects are changing in size between backups, et cetera, all matter a great deal as to the deduplication result. So it's very important for anyone looking at a deduplication product to examine those variables and decide, do I need aggressive deduplication because of my backup rotation? Maybe I'm keeping a lot of data, in which case aggressive deduplication will save me a lot of footprint and cost. Or if I'm keeping a small amount of data, then perhaps I can go with something that's less aggressive, but maybe potentially less costly in a way. So that's the first thing. The other thing that deduplication really, what's really important about deduplication is what is the resulting performance as it relates to both backups and perhaps more importantly recovery. Every vendor that provides deduplication does require rehydration of data that's been deduplicated when it's asked for, when it's read. However, some vendors, including, and I'll include ExaGrid in this camp, have architected their products in a way where they keep backups that are not deduplicated, especially the most recent ones, so that they can be recovered more quickly. In other words, avoiding the rehydration penalty. And if you look at recovery patterns, most of the time, customers are looking for their most recent backups, especially for critical recoveries. You mentioned instant VM restores. You're typically recovering a very recent VM if you're doing instant VM restore. And you want to look at what the trade-offs are between vendors in those critical situations where you're trying to recover an instant VM that's from last night or within the last couple of days, where that's most likely what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I would actually add to that as well that, when we mentioned the instant VM restore and things like that, again, there is, and again, going back to the cost, there is a factor here with, this is one of those intangible costs, which is getting the data back, right? So if I have a failure and I need to get this VM up and running in a hurry, if it's had aggressive deduplication, hydration will take longer. So having a hybrid solution which allows for the aggressive deduplication for long-term archival, but then again having non-deduplicated, cached, as it were, backups to be able to get stuff back up and running quickly. That's a really a great thing, and it's one of the more positive things I've seen come out of tech in the last couple of years.
I think it's very forward-thinking and very proactive in nature because of, Mark, to your earlier point of the primary or the most common type of recovery is just the most recent backup. And I think that's a lot of good forward thinking so that the guys in the audience can find a benefit to knowing that they can get recovery very quickly, but at the same time they've got this sort of long-term, truly long-term, years and years and years, but also sort of shorter long-term. That is, the backup just before the last backup is as small as is possible, kind of a thing. So I love that concept. Now let me do this. I know that both of your solutions, and I want to talk about this sort of still in a vendor-neutral way because that way we're not pitching the audience just yet. But I know you both have a form of deduplication. And so that can become a little confusing maybe for some people where they're going, well, does the backup software do the work, or does the hardware do the work, or are you both doing it and it's duplicative, or what's happening there? And so maybe Mike first, can I start with you? Can we have kind of a bit of a technical dive into each one of those, and maybe you talk about how we can balance storage size and performance with each of your deduplication technologies? And Mike, can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we recommend generally as a best practice is if we have a deduplication appliance that we're writing to, generally we tend to turn ours off and then let the hardware handle it. Because again, anytime the software is doing deduplication, it's going to be processor intensive and potentially very memory intensive. So anything that we can offload to hardware, that's always going to increase performance, and we always definitely recommend that. Now, we do support, obviously, dedupe and then further dedupe from the appliance. For example, if we get like a 2-to-1 dedupe, and then we were to write to an ExaGrid and they get a 5-to-1 dedupe, that's considered 10-to-1. So you can get some really great results out of that. But for the most part, the more that you can offload to hardware, the better, just because it allows our backup software to run much more efficiently because there's less load on it. And also to that point, we do recognize if we're writing to dedupe, you want to compress as well. So one of the settings we have is having a dedupe-friendly compression algorithm. So we've taken care of that as well to allow for, again, good, cost-effective and efficient use of the resources that we have.
And I think Michael put it perfectly. So our best practice at ExaGrid is we utilize Veeam's deduplication-friendly compression and deduplication, and it's a great fit because in addition to what they're able to achieve, then we're able to achieve further deduplication. And what we typically look at when we approach a mutual customer or potentially a new mutual customer is, if your retention is going to be fairly low, 2 or 3 weeks worth of backup data, then there's probably an expensive primary disk out there that would make more sense economically for that customer and, quite frankly, more sense for the Veeam opportunity at hand. With ExaGrid, when you get above 4 to 6 weeks of retention, and we typically see a lot of customers with that, maybe 6 months, maybe years, at that point, then we are going to make far more economic sense because on top of the data reduction that Veeam is going to deliver, we're going to deliver exponentially more data reduction on top of that. So the main ingredient in the decision process, I think, for a given customer is going to be how much data are you keeping, how many weeks, months, et cetera, are you going to keep? And the more you're keeping, the more economic sense a deduplication appliance like ExaGrid might make sense.
So let me ask you guys one more question as I'm thinking about this, and I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the audience. And this is to educate them more than anything. If there are different types of data being backed up, so I'm thinking like a VM image versus, let's say, an SQL Server database versus files, that sort of thing, is the deduplication algorithm different for each? Is it the same one? Does it really matter? It doesn't matter. You get the same performance. What's the answer there?
So I will tell you that based on what we've seen, for example, some data deduplicates a lot better than others, right? So if you try to dedupe an Oracle database, a SQL database, you're not going to get as much as you would, say, a set of flat files. So this is truly where you look at your mileage may vary depending upon that.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is Mark. I would agree as well. We employ something called adaptive deduplication, which has a couple of different nuances to it. So we do adapt somewhat to the type of data, but for the most part, it really does depend on the data type. And Michael's right. The unstructured data, files, et cetera, tend to deduplicate extremely well. Databases tend to deduplicate moderately well as well. And emails, as an example, might be a little bit less, where there's less redundancy in the data. But it is definitely something where your mileage may vary.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate that. So let's do this. I've got just a quick slide here to kind of sum things up, and then Mike, I'm going to hand the reins over to you. Today you've got a couple of slides. Mark, I know you have a couple of slides, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. So if you guys in the audience, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about thus far, I see that William had asked a question about deduplication being memory intensive. I think we kind of already addressed that one. If there are other questions coming in, by all means, stick those in the Q&A box the moment you think of one, whether it's about what we've talked about or what you're about to see in a couple seconds here with the presentations from Mike and Mark. And so I entitled this slide, to sum it up, Living the DR Dream, because we start off with data, data being DR's worst nightmare. So now we're trying to turn it into a dream if we can. And the reality here is, obviously growth is given. I think, Mike, if I remember correctly, we were on sort of the pre-call for this. You said you've never seen a company require less data, like year over year or something like that. And no one's ever had data shrinkage. Or you said something along those lines, and it's very true. You guys know that in the audience. It's just it's always going to be a given here. And as growth increases of data, your challenge for DR is going to be greatly increased as well. And so the reality here, what we're trying to talk about, is the deduplication solves the space issue. If you already have your own storage, you already have your own backup software and so on, you should be looking in to see what you can do with deduplication. That's part of your answer here. And then the reality here is you've got to find a balance between the software and the hardware to make sure that you are getting the maximum, again, I did that again, the minimum amount of space, so I was trying to say the maximum deduplication, but the minimum amount of space taken up while maximizing the performance of both your backups and your recovery. So with that, Mike, I'm going to hand things over to you and take it away.
Fantastic. So again, just going to run really quickly through what we do over at Veeam Software. So we've been in business for about 10 years now, a little over 10 years. Started off doing virtualization backup, and we've pretty much expanded to everything. So key goals here is data availability, business continuity, et cetera. So let's talk about some of the stuff that we do here. Again, managed clouds, private clouds, public clouds, software as a service, as well as on-premise. So here's our platform. We have what's called the Veeam Availability Suite, which is our backup and replication software. And we do backups for VMware and Hyper-V with the hypervisor itself. We have recently in the last couple of years, so we've been, again, known as a virtualization backup vendor for the longest time. Public demand has asked that we start backing up physical workloads, and we did that. So we've been backing up physical workloads for both both Windows and Linux for several years now. But one of the things we have found is that translates very well over the public cloud. So using our agents, you get the same kind of recoverability, granular recoverability as we get on-premise for workloads in, be it Azure or Amazon or Google, Alibaba, whatnot, by using those agents. We also have Veeam backup for Office 365, so anybody who's using Office 365, we can certainly back up your email there. And as of right now, our current version does support backup only for mailboxes, but upcoming in the next couple of months, we'll be releasing version 2.0 of this software, which will back up not only the email, but also OneDrive and SharePoint. And we also have Veeam availability for Amazon Web Services. Now, on top of that, Veeam Availability Orchestrator is an automation engine which will automate your backups, or excuse me, your disaster recovery, as well as create automatic documentation based on that. So again, the key here is to get is availability and being able to get your data back very quickly. Again, SLAs and RPTOs less than 15 minutes on any application at all. We have 57 different ways to actually recover. So high-speed recovery, get it immediately. Data loss avoidance, you can set, and this is completely user configurable for down to 15 minutes, for example, for an RPO, for example. Verify recoverability. One of the things that we do is every single backup that we take, we test it to verify that it's a good backup. We were talking about numbers here earlier. I read a statistic kind of very recently here that said less than 4% of backups are actually tested. So I'm sure that everybody on the call has been in a situation where something went down and, oh my gosh, I hope the backup is good. Well, with us, you don't need to worry about that because it has been tested as part of that. Leverage data. So one of the things we can also do is we can take your backups and we can spin them in a sandbox for testing. Very popular feature. We have a lot of folks. So what this gives us is near live data to test against. So you can spin up, say for instance, I have some applications that requires a domain controller and a bunch of different other application services. I can boot those up from the backup media, test them out in their own sandboxed environment, and then back all those changes out. And I still have pristine backups, but I also know that whatever change I was going to do is either going to work or not going to work. And complete visibility. So we have a couple of different ways we can actually help you monitor what we're doing. We monitor our own backups through a tool called Veeam One, which is a standalone console. We also plug into System Center and Operations Manager. And with that, I can monitor both my backups as well as the hypervisors themselves. So if I've got VMware or Hyper-V, I can get visibility, very, very granular visibility down to what's actually going on there. And that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Michael. I'll take over from here. So this is Marc Recipe from ExaGrid. I wanted to talk a little bit about the partnership. So as Michael mentioned, Veeam's been in business for about 10 years. We've been partners for most of that time. ExaGrid is 100% focused on disk-based backup with deduplication. That's all we do. We're the largest independent vendor in this space, and we have a significant number of both joint Veeam customers as well as installations around the globe. We are a global company with sales and operations across the globe. Our focus as a disk-based backup appliance has been on performance, which is fast backups, shortest backup window, and fastest recoveries. And we employ something called adaptive deduplication to achieve that, which means basically that we take our deduplication algorithm and we make sure that it does not interfere with the backup window. So as Veeam is writing backups to an ExaGrid, we are landing the objects or segments of those backups very quickly, deduplicating and replicating them in parallel, but making sure that our algorithm is not slowing those backups down. And then on the recovery side, because we've allowed those objects to land in their entirety, we've cached them so that they can be recovered instantaneously. So any given customer will have anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks of most recent backups sitting in a high-speed cache that can be booted instantaneously. So to make sure that it isn't that 30-minute, not-so-instant recovery, because the backups are sitting in their entirety and can be run in production until such a time that the original systems can be recovered. So much more like primary disk behavior than a appliance that's doing deduplication and deduplication only. Another primary difference between ExaGrid and the other appliance vendors in the space is we are a scale-out architecture. So we talked a lot about data growth on this call, and data growth obviously can impact a number of different operations. One of them is backup. So as your data grows, unless your backup target grows in performance with that data growth, your backups are going to take longer, your recoveries are going to take longer, your deduplication processes could take longer, replication take longer, et cetera. So with every given ExaGrid expansion, you're not just expanding capacity, but you're expanding network ports, processor, memory, and capacity in lockstep. So as a result, our performance profile grows linearly with your backup data, and therefore you do not experience any degradation in performance. And there's a number of economic benefits that go along with that I'll talk about here shortly. Another key aspect of that architecture is our ability to support one of Veeam's very important features called Scaleout Backup Repository. What this allows you to do is to set up a single object within a Veeam configuration that can then load balance across multiple Veeam repositories. We're really the only vendor where this feature really takes complete hold because of the fact that you can set up multiple parallel paths into multiple computing devices with failover, with automatic load balancing, et cetera, so we can gain highly parallel performance, very, very rapid backups, and very, very rapid recoveries. Another aspect where we work very closely with Veeam is called the integrated Veeam data mover. So in this case, we are actually running a portion of Veeam's technology integrated into our operating system. And the role of this technology is to create a secure communication protocol between your Veeam infrastructure and the ExaGrid installation, which not only is an optimized protocol, meaning it's faster than most writes to disk, et cetera, but it also works very well with the synthetic full concept. And as a result, synthetic fulls are much more rapid than perhaps they would be otherwise. The final points I will make are around the economics of backup. So in addition to the architectural benefits that ExaGrid brings to the table, we've also made a number of philosophical decisions that set us apart from many of the more legacy-oriented vendors. One is that we do not come in and offer you a very low price to get your opportunity on the table and then come back and raise those prices after you've already become an ExaGrid customer. Also, we are not subject to any kind of forklift upgrades. So as a result, you don't have to ever rip and replace your existing ExaGrid infrastructure. It's always going to be something that you can expand infinitely. And on the maintenance costs, many vendors will often offer you maintenance up front, but then use maintenance as a way to force you to the next generation of product. We will guarantee that not only is maintenance a portion of the upfront cost what you negotiate, but also we will guarantee that it will not increase by more than 3% per annum. We also take all of the guesswork out of your sizings. Because of the fact that we're a modular architecture, you do not have to decide up front how much storage should I buy so I do not outgrow it. We can size you for what your current time horizon is, and you can rest assured that you'll never outgrow the architecture. We've eliminated the concept of end of life. So in the ExaGrid architecture, we never end of life a product. We are supporting systems that date back to 10 years. We support the ability for you to mix and match different generations of appliances in the very same system, and we never force our customers to upgrade from old generation hardware to potentially new generation hardware. If that decision comes about, it's based on the customer's desire, not on anything ExaGrid forces you to do. And finally, there are no hidden costs. We do not license any of our features like many vendors do, so all of the capabilities of the product, deduplication, integration with Veeam, replication, and so on are all included. No hidden costs, no trickery whatsoever. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Nicely done, Mark. Thank you, Mike, as well. Looks like we've got a little bit of Q&A here. Let's do that real quick. We'll take some questions from you guys in the audience. As always, if you have some, put those into the Q&A box. We'll be happy to answer those. I've got two that have come in. Actually, I think they're targeted at you, Mark. One is asking what's the largest system that ExaGrid provides?
Great. So that's a great question. So the way we talk about sizing at ExaGrid is we look at the instance of your primary data, or what we would call what is the size of a single full backup. So if you were to add up all of your virtual machine data storage, et cetera, what does that look like? And then we can store, obviously, multiple weeks, months of retention of that. And our current largest system can handle 2 petabyte single full backup with around 16 weeks of retention. So that roughly means that we can accommodate around 40 petabyte of logical data. This is twice as large as any of the other competitive systems in the market today that matter.
It's a whole lot of movies and music.
Exactly.
The other question is, actually, you'd mentioned this beforehand, but they're asking, can you explain the adaptive deduplication one more time?
Oh, sure. Another great question. So what adaptive deduplication really is it means it adapts to the backup environment. Most of the deduplication algorithms that are employed, whether they're in software or in an appliance, behave the same way regardless of the situation. So what adaptive deduplication does is it monitors the throughput rates of your backups and adjusts to make sure that the backups are not being interfered with. So while deduplication and replication is occurring in parallel during your backups, we will throttle the processes of doing that down if we think for any reason that your throughput is going to be interfered with. So the end result is you get the benefits of immediate deduplication, immediate replication. However, if there's any interference whatsoever in how fast your backups are going to run, that'll be throttled down to make sure that the backups can run as fast as possible.
Good answer there. Let's do this. Mike, there's one question that came in for you. They're wondering how Veeam is licensed.
Okay, well, it depends. So we have as of right now, 2 different licensing models. We can do either perpetual or subscription. So perpetual, if I've got an on-premise environment and I've got either Hyper-V or VMware, we're licensed per socket. So say for example, I've got a server that's got 2 physical CPUs in it. That's 2 licenses for that. One of the things we don't really care about is the applications you're backing up, the number of VMs. It's all included in the license. So if I've got a bunch of SQL servers out there, an Oracle server, and these other different things, there's no added cost to that. As long as they're running on a host that's got those 2 physical sockets licensed, that's covered as well as all functionality. Now, with regard to subscription, there's a couple of different use cases for that. So, for example, if I'm backing up cloud workloads, you're going to pay X amount per month or per year based on what you're backing up per agent that you're running. Or another good use case for that would be like managed service providers, for example. They'll buy subscription rates from us for backups based on the number of VMs they're backing up, and then they would pass those costs along to customer, depending on whatever agreements that they have.
Perfect. And it looks like we're at the end of our questions, even though we're a little early here. So I guess we're going to let class out early today, and you guys can go run around on the playground for a little bit, have a little bit extra recess time on us. So Mike and Mark, hey guys, thank you very much for a great conversation. You guys provided a lot of really good input.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who joined us today.
Yep, took the words out of my mouth. You guys in the audience, thanks for your input today. Thanks for your attention as well. With that, Tracy, I'm going to hand things back to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Nick, for moderating. It was a great event today. And like Nick said, thank you, Mike and Mark. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And thank you to the audience for attending this webcast sponsored by ExaGrid and Veeam and presented by Redmond Magazine. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.